"What's your call sign, son?" the Admiral asked, laughing, until the hangman silenced the entire room. The Admiral's laughter died in his throat when I spoke those two words. The hangman. The entire briefing room went silent. 20 officers who'd been chuckling at what they thought was some nobody staff sergeant suddenly studying their boots. I watched the color drain from Admiral Morrison's face as recognition hit him like a freight train. The same man who'd been asking me to fetch coffee 5 minutes earlier now couldn't meet my eyes. Behind him, Colonel Richards whispered something that made the Admiral's hands shake as he reached for his water glass. The racism that had filled this room just moments before evaporated, replaced by something I'd seen too many times, the uncomfortable silence of men realizing they'd just insulted a ghost. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Now, 30 years later, I sit in this same leather chair every morning, watching the sunrise through my kitchen window in Tucson. The coffee tastes different these days, weaker like everything else about getting old. My hands don't shake anymore when I hold the cup, not like they did for the first decade after coming home. The nightmares still visit, but they're quieter now. More like old friends who've worn out their welcome rather than the screaming demons they used to be. This house is small, nothing fancy, just a retired staff sergeant's pension can afford. But it's mine, and it's quiet, and most days, that's enough. The Purple Heart sits in a drawer upstairs, along with some other medals I never talk about. Sometimes I think about that briefing room, about Admiral Morrison's face, about how quickly respect can replace contempt when the truth comes to light. But mostly, I just drink my coffee and try not to think about the names on that wall in D.C. Names of men who never got the chance to sit in quiet kitchens, watching Arizona sunrises paint the desert gold. The sound that brought it all back was a helicopter. Black Hawks flying training exercises over Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, their rotors cutting through the morning air with that familiar whop, whop, whop that reaches into your bones and pulls out memories you've spent years trying to bury. I was reaching for my prescription bottle, the ones that help me sleep, when that sound froze me in place. Suddenly, I wasn't in my kitchen anymore. I was standing in a tent in Kuwait, sand in my teeth and sweat stinging my eyes, listening to our birds warming up for what should have been a routine extraction. Should have been. But nothing was ever routine when you carried the call sign I carried. The bottle slipped from my fingers, pills scattering across linoleum, and I was 28 years old again, watching Colonel Davidson brief a mission that would either make me a hero or get me court-martialed. The helicopter sound faded, but the memory had already taken hold, dragging me back to that blazing hot tent where everything changed, where a kid from Alabama learned that sometimes the only way to earn respect is to first be willing to die for the people who despise you. Camp Victory, Kuwait, March 15, 1991. The war was supposed to be winding down, but someone forgot to tell the Republican Guard units still operating in the northern sectors. I was attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment then, officially classified as a communications specialist, which was military speak for doing things they couldn't put in official reports. Most days were routine. Monitor radio traffic, coordinate supply drops, try not to melt in the 120-degree heat that turned our tents into ovens. The Rangers I worked with were good soldiers, professional, but I was always the outsider. Not because of my MOS, because of my skin color. It wasn't the obvious kind of racism you see in movies, with burning crosses and white hoods. This was subtler, the way conversations stopped when I walked into the mess tent, the way my equipment requests got lost in paperwork, the way I always ended up pulling extra guard duty. Staff Sergeant Williams ran our unit with an iron fist, and he made it clear that while he'd follow orders and keep me alive, I shouldn't expect any special treatment. Fair enough. I wasn't looking for friends anyway. What I was looking for was a chance to prove that a kid from the projects in Detroit could serve his country with honor, even if that country didn't always want to claim him. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Williams said as I entered the command tent that morning, his voice dripping with that particular southern drawl that always made my skin crawl. Captain Morrison. Yes, the same Morrison who'd become an admiral, laughed along with the others, not yet knowing he was making an enemy he couldn't afford to have. "Think you can handle real soldier work today, Jackson? Or should we find you a nice safe desk somewhere?" The tent erupted in chuckles, 20 white faces finding humor in what they saw as a black man trying to play soldier in their war. I'd heard it all before, of course. Growing up in Detroit's Cass Corridor had taught me that words were just sounds people made when they were afraid of what they didn't understand. But this felt different, more pointed, like a test I hadn't studied for. Williams tossed a manila folder onto the table in front of me. "Intelligence reports suggest enemy movement 15 clicks north of here. Recon mission, 4-man team, in and out." His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Think you can keep up?" I picked up the folder, scanning the details while the room waited for me to back down, to request a transfer, to prove their assumptions right. Instead, I looked Williams dead in the eye and said the only thing that mattered. "When do we leave?" The mission briefing revealed what I'd suspected from the start. This wasn't routine recon. The grid coordinates led into a known Republican Guard stronghold, a sector where 3 previous teams had gone missing in the past month. Williams was sending me into what amounted to a suicide mission, with just enough official cover to avoid court-martial if I didn't come back. The other 3 Rangers assigned to the mission, Kowalski, Murphy, and Hendricks, looked about as thrilled as men walking to their own execution. "Look, Jackson," Kowalski said quietly as we prepped our gear, "no hard feelings, but Williams is setting us all up to die just to prove a point about you." I appreciated his honesty, even if it stung. "So what do you want to do?" I asked, checking my rifle for the 3rd time. Murphy shook his head. "We follow orders, we do our jobs, and we try to keep each other alive out there. That's all any of us can do." But I could see it in their eyes. The resignation of men who believed they were about to pay the ultimate price for their sergeant's prejudice. The helicopter that would drop us off was warming up outside, its rotors cutting through the desert air with mechanical precision. As we walked toward it, Williams appeared at my shoulder. "Try not to get these good men killed because you wanted to play hero," he whispered, loud enough for the others to hear. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. The drop zone was 15 kilometers northwest of our base, in terrain that looked like God had forgotten to finish creating it. Rocky outcroppings jutted from sand that stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional cluster of date palms marking underground water sources. Our pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds, set us down in a depression between 2 ridges, the helicopter's rotor wash turning the world into a stinging sandstorm for 30 seconds. Then silence, the kind of absolute quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. "Rally point is here," Murphy said, marking our GPS coordinates. 12 hours to complete recon and return for extraction." We moved out in standard diamond formation, myself taking point. Another subtle insult from Williams, putting the black guy in the most dangerous position. But I'd trained for this, spent months at Fort Benning learning to read terrain, to spot ambushes, to move through hostile territory like a shadow. The rocky ground showed signs of recent activity, tire tracks from military vehicles, scattered ammunition casings, and something else that made my blood run cold. Fresh graves. A lot of them. This wasn't just a Republican Guard position. This was an execution site, a place where captured Americans had been brought to die. I signaled for the team to take cover while I called in our findings, knowing that what we'd stumbled onto was far more significant than routine enemy movement. The radio crackled with static when I tried to reach base camp, the signal blocked by the rocky terrain and atmospheric interference that plagued desert communications. Standard procedure called for maintaining radio silence unless we encountered immediate threats. But the graves changed everything. These weren't enemy casualties. The uniforms and gear scattered around the site were American, which meant somewhere out there, families were still waiting for their sons to come home. "Jackson, we need to move," Hendricks whispered, his voice tight with fear. "If they're using this place for executions, they'll have guards nearby." He was right, but leaving without documenting what we'd found meant those families would never have closure, would never know what happened to their boys. I made a decision that would haunt me for decades. We'd complete the recon mission, But we'd also gather evidence, collect dog tags, anything that could help identify the victims. Kowalski shook his head when I explained the plan. Williams sent us out here to die, and now you want to stick around longer? I understood his fear, but some things mattered more than personal survival. These soldiers deserve to be identified, to go home to their families. We're the only ones who know they're here. Murphy and Hendricks exchanged glances, then nodded slowly. Maybe it was because death made equals of us all, or maybe they were starting to see past the color of my skin to the soldier underneath. Either way, we had work to do. As we carefully documented the site, collecting identification tags and photographing evidence, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a familiar old coat. This was bigger than Williams' racism, bigger than proving myself to a unit that didn't want me. This was about honoring the dead, about making sure their sacrifice meant something even in a war zone where human life seemed cheap. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory, words she'd spoken the day I enlisted. Baby, when you wear that uniform, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every black soldier who came before you, and everyone who will come after. She'd grown up during segregation, had watched her own father return from World War II to a country that called him boy, and made him ride in the back of the bus despite the medals on his chest. But you remember this, she'd continued, gripping my hands with surprising strength for a 70-year-old woman. Your character isn't defined by how people treat you. It's defined by how you treat others, especially when they don't deserve it. Standing in that desert gravesite, surrounded by evidence of unthinkable cruelty, I finally understood what she meant. My war wasn't just against enemy soldiers. It was against the part of me that wanted to prove I was better than the racism I faced, and the more dangerous part that whispered I should just accept it. The attack came without warning, the way death always does in combat. One moment we were carefully bagging evidence. The next moment the air was full of bullets, and the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire echoing off the rocky walls around us. "Contact left! Contact left!" Murphy screamed into his radio as we dove for cover behind a cluster of boulders barely large enough to hide 4 grown men. I could hear at least 6 weapons firing, the bullets striking stone and sending razor-sharp fragments flying through the air like shrapnel. Hendricks cried out as a ricochet caught him in the shoulder, his rifle clattering across the rocks as blood seeped through his uniform. "We're pinned down!" Kowalski shouted, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "They've got us surrounded." Through gaps in the rocks, I could see muzzle flashes from 3 different positions, a classic ambush formation that turned our diamond patrol into sitting ducks. The enemy had chosen their ground well, high terrain with overlapping fields of fire, multiple escape routes, and us trapped in the low ground with nowhere to run. This was exactly what Williams had wanted, a situation so hopeless that failure was inevitable, proof that integrating units led to disaster. But as I watched Hendricks struggle to apply pressure to his wound with one hand while trying to return fire with the other, I felt something cold and familiar settle in my chest. They'd made one crucial mistake. They'd cornered a man with nothing left to lose. I'd been trained for this moment, though not by the Army. The skills came from a different kind of warfare, learned on the streets of Detroit, where survival meant making split-second decisions with incomplete information and deadly consequences for being wrong. "Murphy, how much ammo do you have left?" I called out, my voice steady despite the chaos around us. 2 magazines, he replied, ejecting a spent clip and slamming home a fresh one. "Kowalski?" "Same." That gave us maybe 5 minutes of sustained fire, not enough to fight our way out of a coordinated ambush. But I'd learned something in Detroit that they didn't teach at Fort Benning. Sometimes the only way to win an unwinnable fight is to change the rules. I studied the enemy positions, looking for patterns in their fire, weaknesses in their formation. There, the gunner on the left was firing in predictable bursts, pausing to reload every 30 rounds. The one on the right was nervous, firing too quickly and wasting ammunition. But the center position, the one with the best angle on our cover, was professional. Steady, disciplined, dangerous. That was my target. "Listen carefully," I told the others. my voice carrying an authority that surprised even me. "In 30 seconds, I'm going to move. When I do, you three lay down, suppressing fire on the left and right positions. Don't try to hit anything, just make noise and keep their heads down." Kowalski stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Move where? It's open ground for 50 yards in every direction." That's when I told them something I'd never shared with anyone in my unit, something that would change how they saw me forever. My grandmother didn't just raise me to be a good soldier. She raised me to be a survivor. Before they could ask what that meant, I was moving, staying low and using every piece of cover the terrain offered. Shadows, depressions, scattered rocks barely large enough to hide behind. The skills came back like muscle memory. How to move without creating silhouettes. How to time your movement with enemy reload cycles. How to become invisible in plain sight. This wasn't standard military training. This was urban warfare adapted to desert combat. Techniques learned from older boys in the neighborhood who'd come back from Vietnam with knowledge the Army preferred to forget. I covered the first 20 yards in a low sprint, diving behind a fallen boulder as bullets whined overhead. The enemy gunner in the center position was good, but he was looking for a soldier following standard tactics. He wasn't looking for someone who'd learned to hunt in concrete jungles where the prey shot back. From my new position, I had a clear angle on his muzzle flash. I lined up my shot, controlled my breathing the way Sergeant Hayes had taught me during sniper training. Training that wasn't in my official record because, officially, communications specialists didn't need to know how to kill at distance. But Hayes had seen something in me, had pulled me aside after regular training hours to teach me skills that might save my life someday. "Breath in, breath out, squeeze," his voice echoed in my memory as I acquired the target. The shot took the center gunner cleanly, his weapon falling silent as his body tumbled from the rocky outcropping. In the sudden pause that followed, I heard something that changed everything. One of the remaining shooters calling out in Arabic, his voice high with panic. These weren't Republican Guard soldiers. They were insurgents, probably the same group responsible for the execution site we'd discovered, which meant they knew exactly what those graves represented, and they couldn't afford to let witnesses escape alive. "Jackson, where the hell are you?" Murphy's voice crackled through my earpiece, fear and confusion evident even through the static. I keyed my radio twice, alive and mobile, then began working my way toward the left position. The insurgent there was young, maybe 18, firing wildly at shadows while his partner shouted instructions from the right flank. I could have taken him cleanly from 60 yards, but something about his age made me hesitate. He looked like the kids from my neighborhood, the ones who joined gangs because they didn't see any other options, who carried guns because everyone else did, who died before they were old enough to understand what they were throwing away. But hesitation gets you killed in combat, and when he swung his AK toward Murphy's position, I did what I'd been trained to do. The second shot dropped him mid-turn, his weapon spinning away across the rocky ground. 2 down, 1 to go. The remaining shooter had gone quiet, probably trying to relocate to a better position, or maybe just trying to figure out what had happened to his partners. In the sudden silence, I could hear Hendricks groaning softly, could hear Murphy whispering prayers under his breath. That's when the third shooter made his mistake. He called out in English, "American soldiers, we know you are there." His accent was thick but clear, probably educated abroad before returning to fight against coalition forces. "Surrender now, and we will kill you quickly." The offer was meant to terrorize, but it told me something important. He was alone, scared, and trying to negotiate from a position of weakness. If he'd had backup coming, he wouldn't be talking. I keyed my radio. "Murphy, on my signal, you and Kowalski move Hendricks to that cluster of rocks 30 meters south. I'll keep this one busy." "What about you?" Murphy's voice was tight with concern that surprised me. Concern for the soldier they'd all written off as a liability just hours earlier. "I'll be right behind you," I lied, because we both knew someone had to stay and hold off pursuit while they evacuated a wounded man across open ground. It was a job for the expendable member of the team, the one whose death Williams would explain away as an unfortunate but predictable result of placing unqualified personnel in combat positions. But as I settled into position behind a boulder that offered good cover and clear lines of sight, I realized something had changed. These men were no longer treating me like a burden to be tolerated. They were treating me like a brother in arms. And that meant everything I'd endured, every insult and slight and moment of casual cruelty, had been worth it for this. The chance to prove that courage and character had nothing to do with the color of your skin. The third shooter was moving, trying to flank my position while my team evacuated. Time to remind him why that was a very bad idea. I let him get close enough to see the dust from his boots, close enough to hear his labored breathing in the thin desert air. He was good, better than the other two, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd survived multiple engagements. But he made one crucial error. He assumed he was hunting a standard American infantryman, someone who'd fight by the book, follow doctrine, make predictable tactical decisions. He wasn't prepared for someone who'd learned to fight dirty, who understood that survival sometimes required abandoning honor in favor of brutality. When he rounded the boulder where he expected to find me, I was already behind him, having circled around using a depression in the ground that didn't show on any map. The knife went in clean, just below the rib cage, and angled upward toward the heart, a technique learned not from army training but from an old gangster named Clarence, who'd taken pity on a scared kid from the projects and taught him how to end fights quickly. "Nothing personal," I whispered, as the light faded from his eyes. Because it wasn't. This was just war, just survival, just a black soldier doing whatever it took to bring his team home alive. But as I lowered his body to the ground and retrieved his weapon, I felt something break inside me, some last vestige of innocence that died with every man I killed. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of helicopters, either our extraction or enemy reinforcements. I gathered the insurgents' equipment and documents, anything that might provide intelligence value, then began moving toward my team's position. 3 enemy fighters dead, 4 Americans alive, mission accomplished. But the cost was higher than anyone realized, measured not in bullets or blood, but in the part of my soul I'd left behind in that rocky desert graveyard. The radio crackled to life as I reached my team's position, Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds's voice cutting through static with news that made my blood run cold. "Ground team, be advised. We've got multiple aircraft inbound from the north. Unknown origin, but they're not on our flight plan." Translation: we had enemy air support coming, probably helicopters carrying reinforcements for the ground team we just eliminated. "How long until extraction?" Murphy asked, his voice tight with the controlled panic of a professional soldier who could see the tactical situation falling apart in real time. 15 minutes if we leave now, but we've got weather moving in from the west that's going to make this interesting." Reynolds had a gift for understatement. Interesting, in pilot speak, usually meant potentially fatal. "Why?" I looked at Hendricks, who was pale but conscious, his shoulder roughly bandaged but still bleeding through the field dressing. Moving him across open terrain under fire would be difficult enough without enemy aircraft hunting us. That's when Kowalski asked the question I'd been dreading. "Jackson, what's your call sign?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer, one that would reveal everything I'd spent months trying to hide from my unit. Every special operations soldier has a call sign, usually something descriptive or commemorative, earned through actions in the field. Mine had been assigned 3 years earlier during a classified operation in Panama, an operation that didn't officially exist, but had resulted in the elimination of 12 high-value targets in a single night. The name had stuck, whispered among special operations communities like a ghost story, passed along by men who understood that some soldiers operated in shadows darker than most could imagine. I'd been hoping to serve out my deployment without anyone discovering who I really was, without having to explain why a communications specialist knew advanced combat techniques, why my equipment requests always got approved despite Williams' interference, why certain classified frequencies on my radio were permanently encrypted. But with enemy aircraft inbound and a wounded soldier who needed immediate evacuation, there was no more time for maintaining cover stories. "My call sign is Hangman," I said quietly, watching as recognition dawned in their eyes. Murphy went very still. Hangman? As in the Panama thing? I nodded, watching as everything they thought they knew about me crumbled and reformed into something entirely different. Kowalski's hands trembled as he reached for his radio. Jesus Christ, Jackson! You're not a communications specialist at all, are you? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy with implications none of us wanted to examine too closely. Hendricks, despite his injury, managed a weak laugh. Well, that explains a lot. But there wasn't time for explanations or apologies, or the 1,000 questions I could see forming in their minds. Enemy aircraft were inbound, our extraction window was closing, and somewhere out there, Williams and Morrison and all the others who'd spent months treating me like a second-class soldier were about to learn that they'd been sharing their tent with a ghost, one of the Army's most classified assets, hidden in plain sight among regular infantry, because sometimes the best place to disappear is where nobody thinks to look. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent months trying to prove I didn't belong in their unit, never realizing I belonged in a completely different unit altogether, one that didn't officially exist. The sound of rotor blades grew louder as enemy helicopters approached our position, their distinctive rhythm different from American aircraft, heavier, more mechanical, like giant insects made of metal and malice. 2 Mi-24 Hinds coming in from the northeast, Murphy reported, his binoculars trained on the horizon, armed and looking for trouble. Hinds were flying tanks, Soviet-built gunships with enough firepower to level a city block, and armor thick enough to shrug off small arms fire. Facing them with nothing but rifles and determination was like bringing a knife to an artillery duel. But I'd faced worse odds before, in places that didn't appear on maps, fighting enemies whose names were classified above my team's pay grade. Listen carefully, I told them, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd turned impossible odds into mission success more times than anyone should have to. We're going to split up. Murphy, you and Kowalski get Hendricks to the extraction point. I'll delay the helicopters long enough for Reynolds to get you out. The plan was simple, direct, and almost certainly suicidal. Exactly the kind of thing that had earned me my call sign in the first place. But Kowalski shook his head. We're not leaving you behind. You are, and that's an order, I replied, surprised by how easily command voice came back after months of pretending to be just another enlisted man. My mission parameters are different from yours. I have resources you don't know about, options that aren't in the standard playbook. It was true, though I couldn't explain the details without compromising operations that were still classified 30 years later. Let them think what they wanted, that I had backup coming, that I knew something they didn't, that special operations soldiers were somehow bulletproof. Better that than the truth. Sometimes saving your brothers in arms requires being willing to die for men who've never seen you as their equal. The first helicopter crested the ridge like a mechanical vulture, its nose-mounted cannon already tracking toward our position, with predatory precision. I had maybe 30 seconds before it acquired a firing solution. 30 seconds to do something that would give my team the window they needed to reach extraction. That's when I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I stood up, fully exposed on the rocky outcropping, and did something that no rational soldier would ever attempt. I began firing at a heavily armored attack helicopter with a standard-issue M16A2 assault rifle, knowing that my bullets would bounce off its armor like raindrops hitting a windshield. But the gesture wasn't about causing damage. It was about drawing attention, making myself the primary threat, forcing both helicopters to focus on me instead of pursuing my wounded teammate. The cannon swung toward me with mechanical precision, and in the second before it fired, I saw something in the pilot's movements that told me everything I needed to know. He was young, inexperienced, more concerned with eliminating the immediate threat than following proper tactical protocols. Instead of coordinating with his wingman to pin down all 4 Americans, he was fixated on the soldier bold enough, or stupid enough, to shoot at him directly. The tactical error gave my team the opportunity they needed, but it also meant I had about 3 seconds to live unless I did something spectacularly unexpected. That's when I remembered a lesson learned not from military training, but from my grandmother's stories about her father, who'd survived the Battle of the Bulge, by understanding that sometimes the only way to defeat superior firepower is with superior audacity. I dropped my rifle and pulled something from my gear that officially wasn't there. A man-portable surface-to-air missile, compact and deadly. The kind of weapon that communications specialists weren't supposed to carry, but that special operations soldiers kept for emergencies exactly like this one. The Stinger missile had been my insurance policy, my ace in the hole for the day when my cover story wasn't enough to keep me alive. As I shouldered the weapon and began the target acquisition sequence, I could hear my grandmother's voice again, telling me stories about her father loading artillery shells in segregated units during World War II, how black soldiers had done the jobs that others couldn't or wouldn't do, how they'd saved white soldiers who returned home to a country that still wouldn't let them drink from the same water fountains. "Baby," she'd said, "sometimes doing what's right means saving people who don't think you deserve to exist, but you save them anyway, because that's what makes you better than them." The missile locked onto the lead helicopter's heat signature with a soft electronic tone that sounded like salvation. In that moment, as my finger hovered over the trigger, I understood something profound about the nature of heroism. It wasn't about being recognized or rewarded or respected. It was about making the choice to protect others even when they'd spent months proving they didn't think you were worth protecting. The Hind was less than 200 meters away, its cannon spinning up for a firing sequence that would turn me into a red stain on the rocks. Time to remind them why they called me Hangman, not because I killed without mercy, but because I was willing to hang myself out as bait to save the lives of better men than me. The Stinger left its launch tube with a whoosh of superheated gas and the distinctive scream of solid rocket fuel igniting in confined space. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. The missile streaked across the desert sky, trailing white smoke, and carrying all my hopes for keeping my team alive. The pilot saw it coming. I watched him try to deploy countermeasures, saw the helicopter bank hard left in a desperate evasive maneuver that might have worked against a less sophisticated guidance system. But Stingers don't miss, not at that range, not with a heat signature that bright. The explosion lit up the afternoon sky like a small sun, twisted metal and burning fuel raining down across the rocky terrain in a shower of destruction that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. The second helicopter immediately broke off its attack run, its pilot smart enough to recognize that engaging an enemy with anti-aircraft missiles was above his pay grade. As the sound of rotor blades faded into the distance, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months of military service. The quiet satisfaction of a job well done, of proving that sometimes the most unlikely soldier can be the most dangerous one. But there wasn't time to savor the victory. My team was still exposed, still vulnerable, and our extraction window was closing with every minute we remained on the ground. I grabbed my rifle and began moving toward the rally point, leaving behind the smoking wreckage of the helicopter and the 3 dead insurgents who'd thought they could use American graves as leverage in their war against freedom. As I ran across the desert floor, dodging scattered debris and the occasional unexploded ordnance, I realized that everything had changed in the space of those 3 missile flight seconds. I was no longer the communications specialist that Williams could dismiss and Morrison could patronize. I was Hangman, and that name carried weight in circles where weight mattered. The extraction went smoother than anyone had a right to expect. Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds setting his Black Hawk down in a textbook landing, despite incoming small arms fire from scattered insurgent positions. Murphy and Kowalski had Hendricks loaded and secured before the skids touched ground, their movements efficient and professional despite the chaos of the past hour. As we lifted off, I caught sight of the burning helicopter wreckage receding below us, black smoke rising into the pale desert sky like a funeral pyre for illusions about who I really was. "Control, this is Falcon 2-7. Extraction complete," Reynolds reported over the radio. 4 personnel aboard, 1 wounded but stable, mission accomplished. But I knew the real mission was just beginning. Word would spread quickly through the camp about what had happened out there, about the communications specialist who'd turned out to be something else entirely. Williams would demand explanations I wasn't authorized to give, Morrison would want to know why his intelligence reports had failed to identify a special operations asset embedded in a regular infantry unit, and somewhere in a Pentagon basement, people in expensive suits would be asking uncomfortable questions about operational security and need-to-know protocols. As the helicopter banked toward home, carrying 4 survivors of what should have been a suicide mission, I closed my eyes and tried to prepare for the interrogation I knew was coming. The easy part was over. Now I had to explain to a tent full of racist officers why they'd been sharing coffee and conversation with one of the Army's most classified weapons, hidden in plain sight among the very soldiers they'd been so eager to dismiss as inferior. The debriefing tent was packed with more brass than I'd seen outside of a parade ground. Williams and Morrison, naturally, but also Colonel Davidson, Major Harrison from Intelligence, and a stern-faced woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself as Ms. Carter from D.C. but didn't specify which agency employed her. They'd been waiting for us, which told me that word of the day's events had already reached levels of command structure I didn't want to think about. "Staff Sergeant Jackson," Colonel Davidson began, his voice carefully neutral, "would you care to explain how a communications specialist happened to be carrying surface-to-air missiles into the field?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, dangerous to everyone in the room. I could see Williams sweating despite the tense air conditioning, probably realizing that sending me on what amounted to a suicide mission had nearly compromised an operation he didn't know existed. Morrison looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant, which he had, the bitter taste of having to treat with respect a soldier he'd spent months treating like a servant. "Sir," I replied, choosing my words carefully, "my assignment to this unit was part of a classified operation that I'm not authorized to discuss without proper clearance verification." Ms. Carter leaned forward, her gray eyes sharp as broken glass. "Staff Sergeant, everyone in this tent has been cleared for compartmented information as of 2 hours ago. You are authorized to speak freely." "Samtsai," which meant that in the space of one afternoon, my carefully maintained cover identity had been blown so completely that there was no point in maintaining operational security. Time to reveal exactly who they'd been sharing their tent with for the past 3 months. I took a deep breath and began telling them about Operation Silent Jury, a classified program that embedded special operations personnel in regular units as a force multiplier for high-risk situations exactly like the one we'd encountered. My official designation was Military Occupational Specialty 18X, Special Forces Candidate. But my actual training had been far more extensive, covering everything from advanced marksmanship to psychological operations to combat techniques that weren't taught in any official manual. The call sign Hangman was assigned following a classified operation in Panama, involving the neutralization of 12 high-value targets over a 72-hour period, I continued, watching as William's face went progressively whiter. My assignment to the 75th Ranger Regiment was intended to provide covert support for exactly this type of situation, coordinated enemy action against American forces in a hostile environment. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of helicopters returning from other missions and the soft hum of electronics monitoring radio frequencies across the desert. Colonel Davidson was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. "Staff Sergeant, are you telling us that for the past 3 months, this unit has been unknowingly harboring a special operations asset without proper notification through command channels?" It was a good question, and one that I suspected had been keeping people in Washington awake at night. "Sir, the operation required complete compartmentalization. Any knowledge of my true assignment would have compromised its effectiveness," which was a diplomatic way of saying that if Williams and Morrison had known who I really was, they wouldn't have treated me with the casual racism that had made my cover story believable in the first place. Ms. Carter opened a manila folder that I recognized as containing my actual service record, the classified version that most people in the military would never see. "Staff Sergeant Jackson's actual military occupational specialty is listed as Special Operations Classified," she read aloud. "He has completed training in advanced reconnaissance, counterterrorism operations, psychological warfare, and specialized combat techniques. His service record includes classified deployments to Central America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. She looked up at Williams, who was now visibly sweating. Sergeant Williams, were you aware that sending this soldier on high-risk missions without proper support was potentially compromising national security assets? It was a question designed to end careers, the kind of inquiry that resulted in early retirements and permanent assignments to places like North Dakota missile silos. Williams opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, probably realizing that anything he said would only make his situation worse. Morrison wasn't faring much better. His earlier laughter about fetching coffee had taken on a distinctly uncomfortable quality now that he understood exactly who he'd been talking to. But the most uncomfortable silence belonged to me, because I was finally seeing the full scope of how my assignment had been designed. The racism I'd endured hadn't been an unfortunate side effect of my cover story. It had been an integral part of it. The Army had deliberately placed a black special operations soldier in a unit with known racial tensions, counting on that prejudice to make my presence unremarkable, to ensure that nobody looked too closely at the communications specialist who seemed to know more than he should about combat operations. Colonel Davidson closed his own folder and leaned back in his chair, studying me with the calculating gaze of a career officer who'd suddenly realized he was dealing with something far outside his normal parameters. Staff Sergeant Jackson, I need to understand something. For the past 3 months, you've endured what amounts to systematic harassment from members of this unit. You've been assigned to dangerous missions without proper support, excluded from unit activities, and generally treated as a second-class soldier. Why didn't you break cover and reveal your actual status? The question cut to the heart of everything I'd been struggling with since arriving at Camp Victory. Why had I endured months of casual cruelty when a single phone call could have ended it? Why had I allowed men like Williams to treat me as expendable when my actual military value far exceeded theirs? The answer was complicated, rooted in lessons learned from my grandmother about dignity and character, about proving worth through actions rather than credentials. Sir, my mission parameters included maintaining cover at all costs. Breaking operational security would have compromised not just my assignment, but potentially other assets in the field whose identities remain classified. It was the official answer, the one that would look good in reports and keep careers intact. But there was another answer, one I couldn't speak aloud in a room full of officers who would never understand what it meant to be black in an institution that barely tolerated your presence. I'd endured the racism because proving my worth through actions rather than rank or reputation was the only way to earn the kind of respect that couldn't be taken away when the next assignment came around. The revelation changed everything about how I was treated, but not in ways I'd expected or wanted. Overnight, I went from being the barely tolerated communications specialist to being the unit's secret weapon, surrounded by men who suddenly wanted to be my best friend. Williams, who'd spent 3 months finding creative ways to make my life miserable, was now deferential to the point of absurdity, asking my opinion on tactical decisions and treating every word I spoke as gospel truth. Morrison had requested a transfer to another unit, claiming personality conflicts that everyone understood to mean he couldn't face working alongside a soldier he'd insulted and humiliated for months. The rest of the Rangers walked around me like I was made of spun glass and high explosives, unsure how to interact with someone who'd gone from outsider to legend in the space of a single afternoon. But the transformation felt hollow, built on fear and respect for my reputation, rather than acceptance of who I was as a person. The racism hadn't disappeared. It had just been buried under a layer of professional courtesy that felt worse somehow than the original hostility. At least when they'd hated me for being black, I'd known where I stood. Now they respected me for being dangerous, which was a different kind of cage altogether. Murphy and Kowalski tried to maintain something resembling normal conversation, but even they seemed uncomfortable, as if they were talking to a stranger wearing their friend's face. Only Hendricks, recovering from his shoulder wound, treated me the same way he had before, like a fellow soldier who'd saved his life, nothing more or less than that. 3 weeks after the mission that had blown my cover, I received orders that I'd been expecting since the moment Ms. Carter opened her classified folders. Reassignment to a unit that didn't officially exist, operating out of locations that didn't appear on any map, conducting missions that would never be acknowledged by any government. My time playing communications specialist was over. My carefully constructed cover story dismantled and filed away in bureaucratic archives that would probably remain classified for the next 50 years. The night before I left Camp Victory, I sat outside my tent watching the desert stars, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. I'd enlisted to serve my country with honor, to prove that a black kid from Detroit could be just as good a soldier as anyone else. Instead, I'd learned that the Army was perfectly willing to use my race as camouflage for operations that required someone who could disappear in plain sight, someone whose presence would be unremarkable, because nobody expected greatness from him anyway. It was a bitter lesson wrapped in the flag I'd sworn to defend, a reminder that even in service to country, some battles were fought alone. Williams appeared as I was packing my gear, his face haggard with exhaustion, and something that might have been shame. "Jackson," he said quietly, "I want you to know what happened out there, what you did for my men. I won't forget it." He was trying to apologize without actually saying the words, trying to find some way to acknowledge months of behavior that looked very different in retrospect. I could have accepted his half-hearted attempt at contrition, could have made it easy for him to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his command decisions. Instead, I looked him in the eye and spoke the truth that had been burning in my chest for months. "Sergeant Williams, you spent 3 months trying to get me killed because you couldn't stand the idea of serving alongside a black soldier. The only reason you're talking to me now is because you found out I'm more valuable than you thought. That's not an apology. That's a calculation." The flight home from Kuwait was a C-130 transport loaded with soldiers whose tours were ending, men heading back to families and futures that seemed impossibly distant from the desert we were leaving behind. I sat in the cargo webbing, listening to conversations about college plans and job prospects, and girlfriends waiting in places like Ohio and Tennessee and California, and I realized that I had no idea what came next for me. The reassignment orders in my pocket were deliberately vague. Report to a colonel at Fort Bragg whose name wasn't in any directory, for duties that were described only as special projects. My war was ending, but my service wasn't, and I suspected that the next chapter would make the past 3 months look like summer camp. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I finally allowed myself to sleep, and I dreamed of my grandmother's house in Detroit, of Sunday dinners and church bells, and the smell of her cornbread baking in an oven that never seemed to get hot enough. In my dream, she was waiting for me on the front porch, wearing the yellow dress she'd been buried in 6 months before I deployed, and she was smiling with a mixture of pride and sadness that I didn't understand until I woke up over Virginia, remembering her last words to me. "Baby, when you come home, you won't be the same person who left. That's the price of doing what's right in a world that ain't always right back." The plane touched down at Dover Air Force Base on a gray October morning, and I walked down the cargo ramp carrying duffel bags full of equipment I couldn't talk about, and memories I couldn't share, officially returning from a war that had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Now, 30 years later, I understand the full cost of those choices, the price paid for proving that courage and character had nothing to do with the color of your skin. The nightmares came first, then the insomnia, then the slow realization that the war had followed me home in ways that no amount of therapy or medication could fully address. The Army gave me medals for actions I couldn't discuss with therapists who weren't cleared to hear about them, which meant that the very experiences that had earned recognition were the ones I had to carry alone. The Purple Heart came from a different mission, one that left me with scars on my body and soul. But the real wound was deeper, the knowledge that I'd spent years of my life serving a country that saw my race as a tool to be used rather than a heritage to be honored. I tried civilian life for a while, worked security jobs that bored me to tears, went to college on the GI Bill, and discovered that lecture halls felt like cages after years of operating in environments where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The racism was still there, more subtle but no less present, expressed through lowered expectations and surprised praise when I exceeded them, through assumptions that my military service must have been support roles rather than combat operations. I learned to live with being underestimated, learned to find strength in invisibility, learned that sometimes the most powerful position is the one where nobody sees you coming. But the hardest lesson was learning to live with the man I'd become, the soldier who'd chosen to save people who didn't think he deserved to exist, the warrior who'd proven his worth in blood and fire, only to discover that proof was never enough. The reckoning came in waves, like desert storms that appeared without warning and disappeared just as suddenly. Some days I'd wake up proud of what I'd accomplished, secure in the knowledge that I'd served with honor and saved lives that mattered. Other days, the weight of those classified missions would press down on me like a physical force, reminding me of all the ways that patriotism and racism could coexist in the same institution, the same people, sometimes even the same heart. I learned to live with contradictions that would have broken a younger man, loving a country that didn't always love me back, serving with pride in an organization that used my identity as camouflage, finding brotherhood with men who'd initially seen me as less than human. The medals in my drawer represent moments of extraordinary courage, but they also represent the extraordinary cost of having to prove my humanity again and again, mission after mission, until the proof became part of who I was, rather than something I had to achieve. Williams never contacted me after that night in Kuwait, but I followed his career through military newspapers and official announcements. He retired as a major, with a commendation for his unit's performance during the Gulf War, a commendation that praised the courage and professionalism of soldiers under his command, without mentioning that his command decisions had nearly gotten those same soldiers killed. Morrison made Admiral, as I'd suspected he would, and his promotion ceremony made the Washington Post Society pages, complete with photos of him shaking hands with congressmen and senators who praised his distinguished service record. Neither man ever publicly acknowledged the mission that had changed all our lives, the day when their assumptions about race and capability had been shattered by 3 seconds of missile flight time, and the revelation that heroism comes in colors they hadn't expected to see. The lesson emerged slowly, crystallizing over years of reflection and therapy and long conversations with other veterans who'd fought different battles in the same war. Racism isn't defeated by proving you're exceptional. It's defeated by proving you're human, by showing that courage and character and sacrifice aren't limited by the boundaries that small minds try to impose. The real victory wasn't the helicopter I'd shot down, or the lives I'd saved, or even the medals I'd earned. The real victory was the moment when Murphy and Kowalski and Hendricks stopped seeing me as the black soldier and started seeing me as their brother, when shared danger and mutual dependence broke down barriers that rank and regulation couldn't touch. That transformation didn't happen because I'd revealed my special operations background or demonstrated exceptional skills under fire. It happened because I'd chosen to risk my life for men who'd spent months proving they didn't think my life had equal value to theirs. That choice, repeated over and over in 1,000 small moments of grace under pressure, was what changed hearts and minds in ways that no amount of diversity training or official policy ever could. My grandmother had been right about the nature of true heroism. It's not about being recognized or rewarded or respected. It's about making the choice to do what's right, especially when the people who benefit from your sacrifice will never fully understand the cost you paid to make it possible. The war taught me to be dangerous, but my grandmother taught me to be good. In the end, being good was harder and more important than anything I'd learned in special operations training. The morning light streams through my kitchen window now, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber that remind me why I chose Arizona for my retirement. The heat here is different from Kuwait, dry instead of humid, clean instead of dusty. But the vastness feels familiar, the sense of being small beneath an endless sky. My coffee has gone cold while I've been lost in memories, but I don't mind. Some stories demand their own time, their own space to unfold properly. The helicopter sounds have faded, taking with them the ghosts that visit less frequently now, but never completely disappear. On the kitchen table next to my cup sits a letter that arrived yesterday, postmarked from Ohio, written in the careful handwriting of an old man whose hands shake slightly with age. It's from Hendricks, the soldier whose life I'd helped save 30 years ago, and inside is a photograph of his grandson graduating from West Point, along with a note that simply says, "He knows the story. He knows your name. He knows what it means to serve with honor." 3 generations removed from that desert afternoon, the lesson continues, passed down through family stories about a black sergeant who taught them that heroism isn't about the color of your skin, but the content of your character. The photo shows a young man in dress uniform, his face serious with the weight of new responsibility, his insignia bright with promise and possibility. In his eyes, I see something I recognize: the determination to prove himself worthy of the uniform he wears, the quiet resolve to serve with distinction, regardless of the obstacles he'll face. Some battles never end. They just pass from one generation to the next, carried forward by people who understand that freedom isn't free and equality isn't automatic. If this story found you at the right moment, tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes sharing difficult memories helps carry the weight, reminds us that the price of freedom is paid in currency that goes deeper than blood and treasure. It's paid in the courage to do what's right when nobody's watching, in the strength to save people who might not save you back, in the wisdom to understand that true heroism is measured not by the enemies you defeat, but by the brothers you bring home alive.